welcome. I'm Deborah McPhee, Dean for the Graduate School of Social Service here at Fordham, and I want to welcome everybody here this evening. And I think we'll probably have some other folks coming in as soon as they find their way out of that nice weather out there. But thanks everyone for coming. I want to start by saying how grateful I am that we have our valued colleagues with us tonight to serve on our panel. I know that there'll be other introductions probably, but I just want to say thank you to Jess Danhauser, who is the Commissioner for Administration for Children's Services, to Melanie Herzog, CEO and President and CEO of the New York Foundling, Ron Richter, CEO of JCCA, and Tricia Stevens, did I get that right? Yeah, Stevens, Associate Professor at Hunter College. So thank you all for joining, and of course, Shirley Gattegno-Gable, who is our Carranza Chair for Social Justice for Children here at Fordham GSS. I can't think of a more capable group to take on the conversation of the future of children's services and children and family services, particularly to underserved communities. I think we are in a really challenging time where our notions and concepts of what those services have been and what they need to be going forward is at a time, there's always been challenging conversations and concepts, but I don't think quite as it is right now in the world. And I think there's a lot of conversations to be had, or a lot of things to explore in terms of the concepts that have shaped both systems and the services up to date. And then what's that going to look like going forward? And particularly for us, what's the role of social workers in that future? And what do we need to make that future come to life? So I think I can't imagine more capable people for taking on these challenges. I want to thank you for what you do every day. You do not have easy jobs, and you are leaders, superior leaders in this area. So thank you. I want to thank the folks here at GSS who've helped put all this together, and Shirley Gattegno-Gable for bringing us all together for this conversation. And I want to thank students and everyone who's joining us tonight. So have a wonderful conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, or I'll get yelled at. Okay, we know the drill. I have to use the mic. So thank you, Deborah. And I wanted to thank you all for being here this evening. We were trying to figure out where is everyone else, because 140 people registered. And our latest theory is that we're competing with the beautiful weather. So don't think anything when we lock the doors. No. But anyway, this conversation, our discussion with our panel tonight, I think is very important. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time now, because when hearing students, hearing agency, people working at agencies, and there's like social work was child welfare, right? It dominated child welfare. And every day it seems that it has less and less of a presence in children and family services. And I don't completely understand why, right? And I don't think anyone does, but I thought it would be a great idea to pull some great minds together who, think about it, write about it, and are living with it every day in their professional lives, and help us understand what is the change that's happening in the profession and in, for children and family services, and what we should be doing. So I really appreciate you being here. We're going to be somewhat informal in that I will present some questions, and then we'll have a discussion. And at the end, there'll be time for question and answers. How does that sound? Okay? All right. So if I may, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. For many of you, you probably know them already, but I thought I'd do an introduction, and I did ask them to send in bios. And I took everything you said, but I switched the order because I thought that we'd have students here and it's easier to follow. Like, okay, I got my bachelor's degree, I got my MSW, and then I did this. So I switched the order of things a little bit. So, but it is what you sent me, okay? All right. So I'm going to first start with Jess Danhauser, who is currently the commissioner of New York City's Administration of Children's Services. And Jess earned his BA from Duke. And during the summers, he worked at the Boys and Girls Harbor in their summer camp. And after his MSW from the University of California at Berkeley, or the Berkeley School of Social Welfare, he came to New York, is from what I understand. And I should say that as a student, he did some research on the Adoption and Safe Families Act while he was a student, and he also worked in Senator Dianne Feinstein's office. When he came to New York, he was a special assistant to the commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services, and then he moved over to ACS, where he was chief of staff. And then he was assistant commissioner for the Office of Agency Program Assistance. And then he was the associate commissioner for performance measurement, monitoring, and improvement for ACS. But as we know, just moved to the private sector for a number of years. In 2009, he became the president and the CEO of Graham Windham, a mission-driven organization serving approximately 4,500 children and their families each year. During that time, Commissioner Danhauser was the president of the Board of Education for the Greenberg-Graham UFSD, which was affiliated with Graham Windham. And since becoming commissioner of ACS in 2022, ACS has significantly increased the availability of subsidized childcare, launched new family enrichment centers across New York City, and expanded its innovative CARES model. ACS has been working more closely with New York City Public Schools and other city agencies to make sure that mandated reporters understand that there are other actions they can take to support families before making that call. Additionally, Commissioner Danhauser continues to increase support for older youth in juvenile justice and foster care, and has expanded ACS's Fair Futures. He has also expanded leadership development and career opportunities for ACS staff and staff at provider organizations. I have to say, in fairness, I added that last paragraph, so. Okay. I'm just going to introduce everyone and then we'll go on. Okay, so Ron Richter is the CEO and executive director of JCCA. And for 3 decades, Ron has worked to create more just child and family services system by placing the focus on the well-being of each unique child and family. Now, it was a little hard to untangle Ron's career path because he has his undergraduate degree from Tufts University, a Master of Science, and a JD, so he's a lawyer, from Boston University. And Ron has moved in and out of child services back and forth and also served. Well, I'll get to it. Okay. So he started, after earning his JD, he worked as an attorney at the Community Legal Services, and then he worked at Legal Aid Society for 13 years on juvenile justice issues. From there, he went on to serve as the ACS Deputy Commissioner leading the development of the city's largest evidence-based program to divert young people from out-of-home placements on delinquency cases, and it was called the Juvenile Justice Initiative. Okay, so from there, from ACS, he went back to being, well, this time he was a judge in family court. I hope I have this trajectory.
And it sounds good.
So he was a judge in Queens County, reviewing child protective and family violence custody cases for 6 years. And then he came back to ACS as commissioner. And during this time, he spearheaded a landmark shift in child welfare evidence-based practices geared towards helping parents and children avoid foster care placement, heal from past traumas, and reduce time spent in the system. And then he went private to JCCA, where he has been busily expanding the agency's academic enrichment services and helping the organization become a premier provider of support services for children with complex trauma, chronic illness, or severe emotional disturbances. All right, he serves on all kinds of important mayor committees and national committees. He's a busy guy. Okay, and then Melanie Hartza.
One sentence, y'all. You guys, somebody be a one sentence.
One sentence. She's amazing. All right. So, should Melanie or Mel or Mel's fine. Okay. Is the president and CEO of the New York Foundling. And for those of you who may not know, the New York Foundling has supported hundreds of thousands of children, adults, and families on their own paths to stability, strength, and independence using evidence-based and research-backed programs and services that connect children and families to communities. So Melanie has a Master's of Science degree from the New School Milano School of International Affairs and a Bachelor of Arts from Eckerd College in Florida. And Melanie is also a person who's gone public sector into private. She started as the Director of Policy Advocacy for the Human Services Council of New York City, and then went to work the Mayor's Office of OMB. Then she became Family Services Coordinator for the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, and then the Deputy Commissioner for the Administration for Children's Services. Then she became the Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund, but that wasn't the end. Then she became the Director of the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget, where she oversaw the city's entire budget. And then she became New York City's Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, overseeing all of New York City's social services. And then went to New York Foundling, where she is currently. Okay, we have
Took a lot of job. Mine is going to be a lot shorter.
okay, Tricia Stevens. Say hi, Tricia. Is an associate professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. She has her MSW and PhD from NYU's Silver School of Social Work. And fueled by a firm belief in the power and possibility of recovery and healing from exposure to trauma, Tricia's current research is focused on documenting the effects of complex trauma in child welfare-affected parents. She works closely with grassroots and community-based organizations to translate her research into practice with implications for policy. Focusing on communities of color experiencing poverty, Dr. Stevens uses qualitative and mixed methods research on both a local and a global scale to explore the social and mental health implications of exposure to trauma, with an emphasis on using evidence-informed knowledge to improve outcomes for adults, children, and their families. Okay, and unfortunately, Kathleen um, uh, Brady, yeah, Steppins, right, is um, is is not feeling well, and she's the head of Kafka, which some of you may be familiar with, and she unfortunately couldn't make it down here and is very disappointed. So she sends her best. So I'm going to turn this off. My feet. Thank you for bearing with me, but they're so accomplished, it takes a long time. That is this. Mike? Okay, I got it now. All right. So a little bit on let's say children and families and social work, right? If we go back to, what were the forces that led to the founding of social work? We have the, social casework, which was Mary Richmond, and, the charity organization societies, and their emphasis was on fixing the families, like fixing the parents, fixing the kids, right? And then, of course, we have the settlement house workers who were on, building the communities where people lived, right? And then in between all this were a group of very dedicated people who were interested in getting kids out of the orphanages we had been putting them into. Some in ways that, we, yes, like Charles Loring Brace and the orphan trains, but, doing much more than that. But the emphasis there was on child saving the kids from their communities, from their families, right? And these three streams came together and they all had different priorities, right? But that's what became part of social work. And when these three streams came together, we never quite resolved some issues, and I'm going to mention them this evening because we haven't resolved them yet, okay? And I think that it might have something to do with some of the, of where we are in the controversies of which way to go forward. So what should take priority? Parents' rights or children's rights? Should the focus be on child saving or building communities and families? Is the goal family preservation or child protection? Should we focus on specialized intervention versus uniform standards and treatment? And what environment is best for children? And why isn't income support enough? So I think that our inability to really, resolve these issues lead to a lot of the controversies that we're having today. And so I'm going to start off by talking about why so many of us have come into social work from, a commitment of social justice and dedication to improving the lives of children, families, and communities. And we recognize that our social infrastructure has, in many ways, knowingly and unknowingly contributed to the struggles of individuals and communities. And we see it our role as social workers to make the systems work better. But what's happening today is that, new social workers enter the system and they don't want to be there, right? Many feel that it's overwhelming. So in a field that we once owned, quotations about the owning, Um, there's been so many changes. In the 1960s, um, over half of all social workers were working in child welfare. And most schools of social work were focused on preparing students to be child welfare workers. But now, less than 1/3 of all social workers are working in child welfare. And it's clearly become less attractive as a career option for many social workers. So the turnover rate for frontline staff in New York's foster care program is 57%. And for caseworkers in New York's family foster care, prevention, and residential foster care programs is 42%. So now I'm going to turn to you, Ron. And
I don't. No. Or so. What doesn't feel like storm.
yeah.
I know. No. You don't want them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry. What's your name? What's your name? Len. Okay.
I need the chair.
So, well, thank you, Len. Thank you. But let's hear a little bit about what's happening in, and I hope you'll have more comments and join the conversation when we, try to untangle this. But let's hear about what's happening in agencies with turnover and what are you seeing?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you could just.
Oh. Yeah, so I think that those numbers are clearly, concerning. But I will say that, like being a legal aid lawyer, there is an expectation in certain organizations that it's okay to come in and learn a trade or learn a skill. And I was a legal aid lawyer a lot longer than many. I was there for 13 years, but I spent probably 3 years in courtrooms litigating cases or representing clients in cases. And I do see an analogous situation in social work or casework, frankly, that folks come in for a couple of years and learn invaluable skills in an extremely difficult environment. So, yeah, there are a lot of folks who come into JCCA and they're getting their clinical hours and they're working with terrific teams. Most importantly, they're working with incredible families that have unparalleled resilience. And so my sense is that, yes, we should be worried about too much turnover because it's bad for children and families. You want consistency in the service. At the same time, given the environment in which this work is done, no matter how many times I go to Albany, and I've been going since 1990, begging for dollars, there doesn't seem to be a societal imperative to support our work so that a caseworker or a social worker can have 5 cases. And let's be honest, you can have 1 case and spend your entire 35, 40-hour work week on that one case. Child protective specialists know this. And so at the end of the day, the question is, will we fret about turnover, or will we figure out how to make people's experiences at our agencies the best they can be and try really hard to support people, which is not easy, and it's getting harder and harder because I think folks expect so much in their relationship with employers. But at the end of the day, I think we have to work today with the workforce we have today and still try to obtain and achieve our mission.
Mel, want to say something about turnover at your family? And
Sure.
you all have your own mics, so we should.
And you all have your own turnover.
I was going to say, I'm sure Jess has a
Except
say.
Professor.
I thought the students were still there, so I can talk a bit about that.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Ron said. I think what we are struggling with is a workload problem. I think that a lot of times my leadership comes to me and they're talking about turnover, and I'm like, no, you should be talking about retention. And we've done now for the second year an employee sentiment survey. And I think the first year that I was here at the Foundling, it was, stressors, coming out of COVID. But workload has been a consistent thing. And I always say, I'm pretty sure when you're going to social work school, I most certainly know when I was getting my undergraduate degree, people weren't talking to me about data entering into 50 systems. There's an audit coming. There's this other thing coming. You have to deal with this outside provider, this documentation. Otherwise, we're going to get dinged for it. Wait a minute. We're having an argument with behavioral health over what to do with this case. And so all of those things, right, impact your retention of staff. And so what we're trying to do is work smarter and not harder. How can we streamline work? But I think one of the biggest challenges, and I was talking with Deborah about this, is we over-promote, right? Just because you're a great social worker doesn't mean you know how to manage. And coaching is not the same thing as managing. And I think we have done, and I'm talking about the Foundling, a disservice by not investing more in management training for our leadership teams, right? And so the social worker becomes a supervisor, becomes an AVP, and then suddenly, there's a lot of challenges around workload, and there's no understanding of why that is because everything just becomes layered. And so that's one piece that we're working on. I think the other thing is competency. And so when I came to the Foundling and you look at job descriptions and it's a list of tasks and standards, well, anybody can come into an interview and rattle off tasks and standards, but that's not what we're looking for. It's competencies. Are you the right match for the job? Because that's also retention, right? You don't want to set somebody up for a position in whatever particular program it is to fail because those competencies don't match. And so it was painstaking, but from the ground up, we started asking our own teams to write out their job descriptions based on competencies. And I think it's created a lot of buy-in from our teams and goodwill because it's really shifting the conversation from what I think they should be doing and the competencies to what they should think they should be doing. And then the last thing I'll say is, and I'm shocked by this, in all of our funding and all of our contracts, I know, Ron, is big, COLA is very important. Longevity is another thing too. In city government, when you work in these jobs, longevity matters and you get paid based on longevity. When you come into the nonprofit sector, if you've been with an organization for 3 years, your contract stays the same value for those 3 years. So somebody comes in hired at the same salary as someone at 3 years. And I came in and I was like, this has to stop because, if you've invested your time and energy into an organization for 3 years and the person who's just started 5 months ago is making the same salary, why would I continue to work? But it is shocking how all of our funding is set up to not acknowledge that at all. And so I find that we're juggling not just COLA, but really investing in our staff who love what they do, right? And not everybody can be a manager, but how do I retain people if I can't pay them for the time that they've been at the organization? So
that's just a couple things that we're struggling with. I could go on. That's why Deborah dragged me onto this panel, because I called her about all these things that we're doing. But yeah, and I think the sentiment surveys also made a difference, because it's listening to the staff and what their challenges are versus, again, me or my leadership telling them what to do and what their challenges are. So
Thank you. Well, I'm going to move us from that and talk a bit about, the effects of vacancies and staff turnovers on it not only destabilizes agencies, but it also means interrupted services for children and families. And these are children and families who already had or suffered through many stressors and changes in their lives, and we are contributing to that. And so, Trish, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. What kinds of effects are there on children and families as a result?
Sure. Can you hear me? So I actually wanted to follow up on Mel's point, because even though I'm not in an agency, at Hunter, we have a mental health scholarship program, and the majority, all of the students in that program are OYR students, so they're working in the field. So I'll share a little bit, two things about what I've noticed about our students, because they're heavily invested in finishing their program. So they're tied to work in a way that some other employees are not. They're expected to work in their position for the duration of their education, and then to stay for 2 additional years. It's a wonderful program, by the way. But what we've noticed is, as attrition is happening around them, their workloads are just getting inordinately, just almost unbearable. And so we've done an informal survey of other OYR students, and that's what we're seeing, is that they're in their educational programs, but there are other folks around them who are just leaving their programs. And this is in child welfare settings as well as mental health settings as well. So this is something we're seeing at the university level. Just on I sometimes reflect on my experience as an MSW. I was at Boiler Psychotherapy Center in Queens, and I remember that hallway. As an MSW, I had over 100 years of experience on that hallway. And there were doors open, and I could walk in if I had a challenging experience, and I could just, can I please get someone to talk to? And I'm not hearing that from our students now. I'm hearing students being asked to take on really challenging cases on their own, without the guidance that they need to make sense of it. So they come into the classroom trying to make sense of it, and we do our best. The students who fare the best are the ones who feel connected to supports at their agencies. They feel connected to their supervisor. They feel like they can go to someone and have their questions answered, and that they won't be judged for not knowing, because they're going in and they're brand new. They may have been at the agency for 5 years, but they might be really new to a particular role, and they're learning, and they need to feel like they have the space to learn as well. So that's something I can share with you just from the educational setting. But I do a lot of community work. And so yesterday I was actually meeting with parents, and what stands out to me about the question you just asked, Shirley, is that one parent said, yeah, I had 5 caseworkers in the space of less than a year. And you can imagine, it's been years since her case was closed. She's still disoriented. She still has no idea, like, how to make sense of that experience. And I get the feeling that maybe some of the caseworkers also didn't know how to make sense of what was happening around them, and they chose to leave. But what that means is the continuity. If you had to think of the story of this family, each time a caseworker leaves, they take a piece of the story that will never be told. And so that's a, did I say something?
No.
Well, I thought the mic went out. Like, cut the mic. But it is. You think of, I think of my nephews, right? So I've got two nephews now who are both taller than me and remind me of that every time I see them. And there are times I tell them stories and their eyes, they're sitting there, they're grown men now, but they turn into little kids because I'm the keeper of their stories. And I tell them something about themselves that is valuable to them. And that is my role as their auntie. I've been in their lives, their whole lives. They only know, hey, auntie, right? But who is the keeper of the continuity of the families that we work with? If 5 in 1 year is not uncommon. And so perhaps if we shift to this idea of how are we engaging with families in this deeply relational way, because it is deeply relational, it's family, right? And how are we ensuring that that story and that continuity while this family is in our care is given primacy? I think it's one of the things that, you know, Ron and Mel and Jess, you do the numbers on it. I'm the social worker and I was psychodynamically trained. So I'm going to talk to you about the story, and I'm a qual researcher. And that's the continuity. How will this person make sense of their life once they've left us? How do we ensure that their children don't come back to us, which is of greatest importance to me? If we've touched this family, in some way their outcome should be different. So how do we do that in ways that I think takes a re-envisioning of the work we do? And if we have that re-envisioning, will we, in fact, have more buy-in from our staff? And absolutely from families. If one caseworker who speaks to that family honestly and says, listen, I'm not sugarcoating this, because honesty is the best policy. This is going to hurt. And it hurts, but she knew, that mother knew it was going to hurt in advance. And the caseworker says, I'll be right here. That builds trust. And if they're there for the whole year, that's continuity. So that's all I think I have to add at this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Trisha. I think that's really important that we not only look at the systems, right, and the numbers, but appreciate the impact it has on the people we're trying to help. So, you know, Len was a great prompter for this. You know, despite the alignment of social worker and child welfare, for many, many years, today, less than 15% of child welfare agencies require staff to have social work degrees. And some people claim this is a deprofessionalization of the profession and the workforce. And then others have questioned whether there is a need for social workers, right? So the question is, if fewer social workers are serving children and families, then who is providing the services? And is it affecting outcomes on children and families? Going back to what Trisha was saying.
Good evening, everybody. Absolutely. I do want to start by saying I don't think deprofessionalization is necessarily always a bad thing. I think that we have seen over the last decades how vital the role is of parents with lived experience, peer support, and we underinvest in that. And I think we need to continue to make sure we're investing in that work. That is where so much of the trust stems from in the work that I see. That there's someone that they really believe on their side, and that allows for a lot of the professional work, if you will, to begin. Because until you have that trust, you don't have an opportunity to really make change. I do want to say hello to all my ACS colleagues. There's a lot of you in the audience. And one of the things that I did when I came to ACS was spend as much time as I could in our borough offices, in our community centers, in places where I could really understand the experience of children, families, and our staff. And I wasn't surprised, but I was deeply encouraged by how much change they wanted. They don't want to work in systems that are full of fear about doing the wrong thing, that are fully templated. We haven't, and this goes for our provider staff as well, who feel, Mel said the word dinged, that feel like they are chasing a paper down. And when I got to ACS, we had a variety of templates that have been developed, all from something that had gone wrong. And so we developed this template because of this particular instance and that template. And by the time you got done with all of them, none of them were evidence-based. None of them were necessarily valid. They were just protecting against that particular thing happening again. And so we haven't treated, whether they are social workers or otherwise, we haven't treated our professionals with respect. That when we trust you to see the family in front of you and to develop and co-create with them a real partnership. I think that's so much of why people are flocking from our system. An interesting dynamic is that folks who come to our system are deeply eager to get their MSW. And since 2016, ACS has supported over 250 of our staff to complete their social work degrees. We're starting to extend that to scholarships to providers, and as you mentioned earlier, invest in leadership development. I think all of that really matters, and our PDP people are here. But I don't think it's just about the degree and the license. It is what Dr. Stevens talked about, the skill to be able to sit with a family and to not have in the back of your head a million things you need to get done, but to have in the front of your head, how can I be truthful here? How can I help start a pathway towards real change with this family? And, I think the good news here is we have so overinvested in the things that don't work that if we can truly narrow that, there are resources to be reinvested in the work that we need to do. At ACS, we are working really hard to train school systems and hospitals and shelters to be much more judicious in how the state central registry is used, and to understand that there are pathways to help. We have to reinforce those pathways at the same time, and the getting the budget out to providers and where the work really is needed is work we are trying to advocate for day in and day out. And I just want to say that I think we have the human resource from having had the opportunity to be across the system and also across this city. There are so many people with skills and the commitment to take care of families. I've never heard a parent say, I don't have enough people in my life. They've got enough people in their life. We give everybody 10 people and all 10 are overwhelmed because we've segmented and over-professionalized our helping systems. And so, you have your case planner and your coach and your care manager and your caseworker and every single one of them goes home at night and feels like they can't get it done. And so I think that's hard because it starts with funding streams at the federal level and otherwise, but we have to find ways, I think, as a social work community, as people who are interested in actually helping, to not hang on to our corner of that universe, but to find ways to bring that all together.
And I think we can all agree that that's what we want. That's the kind of system we want to create. And this goes back to Mel's comments a little earlier, where she was talking about matching the competencies to what children and families need. So do we need social workers there? Or can can we be training, caseworkers, or can we be training psychologists? I mean, the field has changed, and do we need the social work skills there? And that I'm just opening this for anyone.
I'll go quickly just to say yes and. I think social workers are vital. I think Dr. Stevens talked about having those mentors who've done this work for a long time to teach you. And I think if we can position them and provide longevity, as Mel is talking about, where they're in the field as professionals who are doing that core work, that they can be catalysts for so much skill development across the board. I just don't think it has to be one or the other.
I can you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Of course. Not that.
Okay, you like
I like yours. So I would say that in my experience with direct work with social workers, the value that they bring has a lot to do with the underpinnings of social justice and social work. And that there is a difference between a college grad who becomes a caseworker, and you all know there are amazing college grads who become caseworkers, and somebody who has been educated in the concepts of social work and the value, even if whether it's one client or it's a class of clients, a group of clients, understanding that there are ways that you can help a person advocate and be far more independent and develop agency. And I think social workers do that. I think that there is definitely a role for social workers. I also think that there's a role for lawyers, and that it is about a multitude of disciplines that form a team, so that the child or the family or both have an understanding of sort of how things work from different disciplinary approaches. And I do see tremendous value in social workers. At JCCA, we continue to have only social workers do our preventive work. And that's because the preventive work is tremendously difficult. And the families are entitled, in our view, to someone who has been experienced with work in the field in various ways, to clinical exposure, to the policy underpinnings of why. And so I feel strongly that it isn't only social workers, but they add a critical component to a team working with a family that's struggled. I do want to just say that I agree with what the doctor said. I think what she, no, there is no but. When I was thinking about, these remarks, I think that what she described is, can a family develop trust? Because if they don't have trust for a child welfare agency, which in some cases represents, the opposite of trust, and that takes time. That is not, and our legal structure does not allow for time. There is no time. It is all about permanency and achieving permanency and completing FASPs and doing reports and getting to court, reporting to the judge, waiting for the outcome. What's the cookie cutter case plan? And that is not because of the caseworkers or social workers. It is because of the infrastructure. And that, I think, is, as others have pointed out, a large part of why we see turnover, because we're not giving people the opportunity to develop trust. That is the worst thing for our families.
I will just add this, that I think too, we aren't, and this is building off of what Ron just talked about, which I agree 1,000%. We're also not strategically thinking about where we have social workers, right? And so the amount of conversations that I have, perfect conversation last week with the head of my behavioral health, like, tell me, you have your staff are seeing our children in foster care. What does a sociotherapist do? And she's like, my job. And I'm like, why is that? Well, that's the way ACS has set up the system. And so there is this also, yes, it's the system. And I'm like, but I'm not going to accept that, because why can't we have a conversation differently? What's the worst that we're going to be told? No. But, I think this idea of we have this program, it's for this staff, and it's all of these positions we fill in this one, and it's this, and here's a new RFP in this program. It's like you get to the point where you're like, one person can do this job versus 25 people. And then when you think about how many, to your point, how many staff and systems touch one family, it is no wonder, right, that you don't have that story, you don't have that connection. And it's not only a frustration for the family, and you could be doing your best work, but it's a frustration, right, for staff too, that they are confronted with all these systems and services. And I actually think I completely agree with Ron on social workers and preventive, most certainly in foster care. I think foster care is the one area where we haven't done enough support for our staff at all, particularly case planners. And I've had this conversation, when I first came here with Ron, I'm like, with Jess, my goodness, like a case planner who is a bachelor's in social work, comes out, we train, of course, goes in front of a judge, dealing with the behavioral health staff, dealing with mental health. It's like, that is a lot to handle and manage in one person. And all of those different systems and services, to Ron's point, have different perspectives. And that person is confronting all of those different perspectives. And that's like, no wonder we can't keep people. But it's also, is that the right level of staff for that position? Are we setting them up for success or failure? These are the kind of questions that, I tackle all the time and I think about all the time. And we're a large organization, we're not just child welfare. More than half of our operation serves people with developmental disabilities. And trying to then get our, teams to think even bigger about our organization, that we're one organization, that is even more of a challenge as well. So I just wanted to jump in on that point.
So I'm just, Mel, I was just nodding over here, just agreeing with you, because I'm thinking of several of my students so I'm teaching remotely this semester. And so I have the squares. And so I get the advantage of seeing like the faces of like 28 people, like they scroll across. And the moments I'm teaching the advanced clinical practice and trauma course this semester, and the students were like putting their hands up and then they're working with young people and with families, and they're like giving me the examples, and I'm like, well, I always make suggestions. I just figure, even with all the years of experience, I'll make a suggestion whether or not they want to pick up on it. And to have them say, I'm going to try that tomorrow. They're writing down furiously everything we're talking about and saying, I'm going to work tomorrow and I'm doing this tomorrow. And they've been doing this work, some of them, for 10 years. And it's like drinking water because they really are just trying their best with what they have. And so do we need social workers? I hope so, because I don't expect my students to know everything when they graduate, but I do expect them to be different than when they started. And that's my measure of success with them. Are they different? And I see them being different after they've gotten the training. And I know that they're taking it back to their workplace because a lot of them are OYR, right? And so they've been doing well. They're seasoned. I love my OYR students because they rock it. They come in and they give all of these examples. And I'm like, that's great. We don't need this case study. Let's just put that down. Let's talk about what's happening here and now. and still they're seeking knowledge, right? So so yes, even with the seasoned folks who've been with us for years, I think social work has a place, the training has a place.
I'm going to pick up on that, on training, Trisha, if you don't mind, or Dr. Stephen. And for, as we were building the social work profession, training was such an important part of it, that we be properly trained and we have the appropriate skills. And since the 1980s, we've put a lot of money, by we, I mean this country, into the training of social workers. Because, in the 1980s, we started to see that maybe child welfare wasn't accomplishing what we wanted, and it was, in some cases, doing more harm than good. And, thanks to the efforts of some of these people, that has turned around. But we certainly felt that if we had a better trained workforce, then we would see better outcomes in child outcomes, that children would be better helped by the system, they would have better lives instead of many of the outcomes that we saw. But what happened, if you go to the literature, there's no direct relationship between more training and better outcomes for children. And I just wondered if, you have any comments about that? Like, why aren't we seeing better trained social workers and better child outcomes?
So I would say a few things. One is I still think training is absolutely necessary. It's just not anywhere near sufficient. And I think thinking about investing in leadership development is also so that folks can be coaching day in and day out and sort of building on those skills that you learn in training. We don't have that built into our systems. It's you go to a training and then you come back here and try to make all of that training work. And one of my favorite sayings is culture eats strategy for breakfast and also eats training for lunch. If the culture is not there, if the culture doesn't support the type of risk-taking that one needs to do to be in this work, the challenge is not only to get a family to trust us, it's to get staff to trust the family, that we can see belief and capacity in that family. We'll take it a step at a time, but our staff are scared to trust families because they don't trust the system that's going to come down on them. When I came to ACS, every critical incident that happened was an automatic referral to the Department of Investigation. I might want you to turn off the cameras. And what was that message? That you did something, not only did something go wrong, that you did something wrong, that's another step, and that you did something wrong that was also potentially fraudulent or criminal. So we have to undo these systems that we've built. So I know your questions about training. We have made enormous strides in workforce. I think when people come to the types of training that they're seeking, we're seeing a lot of people essentially pick from our menu of services from across the provider network. The simulation training is better and helps a lot, but it has to be connected to the culture. I love the movie. I think it's A Few Good Men. And at the end of it, he picks up the thing and says, show me in the manual where you go for lunch. And you can't show anybody in the manual where you go for lunch, but you know where you go the day you show up. And so based on where everybody else is going. And so I just think that is the place where we have to put our heaviest emphasis in changing the culture.
So I just want to jump in. I was thinking, as Jess was talking, I was thinking about your question as well. And I definitely agree with the culture. But I think the pairing training and outcomes for children together in such a way really occludes this entire larger system here and brings it down to the two people interfacing. And I think if it were that's the very old visiting model, that through the force of my presence in your life, I will change your outcomes, when they still have to live their lives. Right? And so if we have to take a macro view, and training is one piece of it in that relationship, but this isn't the only determinant, right? So there's an entire system that is surrounding this family. And they also have to live in the world. They have to find food. They have to work. They have to do all of these things. I think training is one piece, but I think a larger shift has to happen in the culture, but also in policies that box families in ways that we see happening repeatedly, and they tell us, but we can't hear it because it's so ingrained in our policy and the way that we do things, that we just kind of breathe through it and go, well, you're going to have to get used to this. But it's the thing they need to change.
I was going to say something about sort of what we're training about, and thinking that the more that I am in this work, the more I think that, among the competencies that Mel was referencing, that there really needs to be a capacity for self-reflection. There really needs to be a capacity to understand how you may be perceived by someone else, and how the system is viewed as extremely judgmental. And how is it to be part of the system that is perceived that way? And what are ways in which you can demonstrate, and I think this can be trained on, what are concrete ways in which you can demonstrate that you and whoever you're working with are human beings, and that there is empathy, and that I always say to new classes at JCCA, please remember that you are working with a family that has had better times in their life. We're intersecting with them at possibly the lowest point. When were you at your lowest point? How vulnerable did you feel? I'm not sure we train on those concepts terribly effectively. That leaves the people in the workforce feeling really bad. The majority of them do not come to work to judge other people. They come to work to support other people. And so I think the nature of training and what we're able to do in human services, we maybe need to reframe a little bit.
What I'm hearing is that we need social workers there, right? But we're not using the skills of social workers as well as we could be, and not creating systems that they can be most effective, right? So that's about changing our approach and our organization, right? And
I think there may be inherent conflict, right? About ethics and principles in what folks are being asked to do in their jobs. And that might be a lot for people to live with. And so they leave.
Yep.
Because they didn't come to social work to feel like they're harming. And sometimes they do feel like they're harming. And sometimes they know they're harming. And I think they leave.
To build on that, one of the things that occurred to me recently in one of our quality improvement sessions was we've spent decades investing in assessment for social workers, for caseworkers. How do you assess? How do you assess? How do you assess? And the other day, our deputy commissioner for child protection and I said, all right, y'all, we're not going to know exactly what happened here. And we don't need to. We need to start helping. at this moment. And we have, and I think we can build that culture. I think the good news is that we have so many people who want to get to helping if we let them. And we're starting to build systems. It's going to take time. These systems were built over decades, right? And so to really reinforce that that is what we are hoping for. And it's a skill too, right? We just haven't taught it. And so obviously things like motivational interviewing, other skills that allow us to connect with everyone's intrinsic desire to do well are what we need to lift up. And I'm hopeful, but I also understand that we have taught people that if they can figure it out, get to the bottom of it, diagnose it, then there's a solution out there. And I don't believe that's how people change. I think we know they change in community and relationship and supports. And so, and I shouldn't just use the word change, that they grow or they get the help that they need. It's not always about change.
Okay. Well, I want to move us on to talking about a new approach, right? Because I mean, Dorothy Roberts and many others have called the child welfare system a family regulation system or a family policing system that's fraught with racism, classism, and a lot of other isms. And that as social workers, we're forced to work within this system that we don't stand for, right? And it also reinforces oppression, and that's not what we became social workers to do, right? And I know, Trish, I don't know, Trisha, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
How much time do we have? I do. So I think the words that we haven't said are the impact of the child welfare system on Black families in particular. Black families, I will speak for myself. I have friends who are highly educated, well-resourced Black mothers who have been investigated. I am not speaking in theory. 50% in some communities are going to be investigated. That is 1 in 2. If I'm sitting with my friends, that's half of us. So we're not talking about families living in certain communities. We're talking about almost every Black mother being out there going, okay, let me see you before you go to school. Are you okay? Let me see, turn around. I literally have another friend who was asked to sign a document because her son, who is very light-skinned, had a bruise. She has many white friends as mothers, and one kid had a black eye. No one asked that mother to sign a document. This is not in theory. When I go to the family court, some of the police officers get confused. I'm a Black woman. They don't know how to treat me. And so I smile sometimes, or sometimes I just watch them to see how will you treat me, because I want to know how parents are treated. And I've gotten to take my stuff out my bag, going upstairs, no water, dry throat, being like, dang, I could have used my water. Or going through the other line and keeping my water. It's nice to have water. Really nice. So I've seen it. I spend a lot of time with parents, and almost universally they're Black or brown. And if they're white, most often they're low resourced with money. I don't like the word poor anymore because poverty is, you can have poverty of spirit and have full pockets. So, and I know many people who don't have much money and they are rich. They are wealthy in relationships. They are wealthy in joy. They are wealthy in community. Having no money doesn't make you a bad person, doesn't make you a bad parent, but having more money can help you be a better parent. I did ask how much time do we have, right? So, when we talk about the history of the child welfare system, we also have to be very clear. It was never meant to serve Black children. It wasn't. We had to be let in, as always. And when we were let in, shortly after that, the child welfare system became a less supportive system, and the funding of removals increased. This is our history. Until we deal with our history, we will go nowhere. So, you did ask me on this panel. You knew what you were getting. Did I?
Yeah, no.
You
So,
knew what you were
so,
getting.
so I do want to chime in. I don't disagree with anything that Dr. Stevens said. I agree with everything that she said, and I think this goes back to something that you said, Shirley, when we started, which is this notion that it's dichotomous, that somehow we're going to either protect children or we're going to support families. And that is a dichotomy that I think that dichotomy is ridiculous, right? Because you really do support children when their parents have what they need, and when they don't feel judged. So I think that part of our challenge today is a good one, which is that we are now very persistently talking about the disproportionate representation of Black families and accepting that it's steeped in racist institutions. And me, for example, running a 202-year-old organization, has to accept that there are things about the way we're doing things at JCCA, I always say it's like part of our DNA, that are inconsistent with what we say our mission is. So how is JCCA advancing what the doctor was talking about? And we do a lot of stuff that we have to question. So why are we calling the state central registry on a child when they return from a visit and the kid who's 4 says, "My mommy yanked my arm across the street, it really hurt"? Why would social workers think, oh, we should call the SCR? What's going to happen when you call the SCR? A family that's already in foster care is going to get investigated and tormented. So how do we at JCCA ask questions? Why would we call the police on a client? Why? Why would we? That seems crazy to me, right? But we've done it. You can go further and say, who are the vendors we're using at JCCA, right? How much furniture do we buy for families and children? Who are we buying it from? Because there are a lot of furniture stores in the communities that we serve. Until we realize that it is up to us to address this tremendous disproportionality, a lack of trust in Black families to be able to parent their kids. You can't tell me that, like, that's true, because it's not. It's very hard, though, to address these cultural issues without saying them out loud. And I think for many years, we just didn't say them out loud. But we should, and it shouldn't be Black people that are saying it. It should be those of us who are responsible for running agencies who are sometimes white. They're sometimes Black too. But the point is that it's part of our professional responsibility to say, why are we keeping Black kids in care longer than kids who are Latino or white kids or Asian kids? Why? It's a trust issue, because we come to work every day having not grown up in a shoebox. We come to work having grown up in a world that has told us that Black people are not like white people. And we really have to address that interpersonally. And when I say self-reflection, that's what I mean. As a judge, and then I'll pass it on, I have had times when there were two cases, one next to the other, and in my mind, I easily paroled the white kid and struggled with whether I should parole the Black kid. Why? Because I was brought up not to trust. Not because I have bad parents, but because this is the United States of America. I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, an amazing town that had the first voluntary integration of its school system. And yet, it's a powerful thing. And I don't think that means we have to stop trying to protect children and support families, because I think we have an obligation for children to be safe with their families. But I do think that before we get to that, we have to get to our own really reckoning personally. And that is very hard to do. And it is. And social work schools should have something to do with it, by the way. The conversation that I just had should not just be about how ACS is bad and parents' lawyers are good. And I don't want to work for ACS. I want to go work for Bronx Defenders. That should not be the conversation in social work schools. It should be about self-reflection and understanding where you come from and how that impacts who you show up as. Until we do that, we're kind of screwed.
No, we're doing that. Well, I know that this change in approach, that ACS has started it, and I guess I'll ask you, Commissioner, is it having an effect?
So I want to say I don't think ACS started it, but we are listening and we are reflecting, and I think we have to give credit to leaders in the community that decided to stand up and say, no, I'm
I meant
I know.
ACS is starting to
I-
change its
this is
approach.
sorry, it's not a retort, Shirley. I just want to make sure that folks know that we at ACS believe that the voices, and I think broke through, frankly, in some ways because of social media, in some ways because of COVID and an insistence. But the voices have been there, right? And now they're breaking through, and we're listening, whether we were forced to or we did it willingly. We are listening, and we are grateful for those voices, even when they're difficult to hear. To Ron's point, we are at the closer to the beginning of our journey than the end, I would say. I think a lot of things we talked about tonight are underway, but we're just laying the foundation. You know, one of the hopeful things I can say is that we have reached, Catherine can tell me, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 public school personnel. And we have seen, even at a time when there's significant challenges with attendance, we've seen an 11% drop in reports from public schools, who typically have the lowest rate of maltreatment that is found after a call. And a lot of that is just undoing. We're seeing an increase in calls for support outside of the, it's about 30 from a month to 150. So we got a long ways to go to get to the size of our system. You know, Trish and I were talking in the beginning, and I told her that, and she said, how about the hospitals? So we're working on that next out of the shelters. And when we looked at the training we were doing for the Department of Education, it included the names of children who had died. And I was like, this is what we are avoiding. This is what we're training you on, is preventing this. We used to have 50,000 children in foster care. We now have about 6,355. We now have about 6,300. Unfortunately, the number of children who die every year to abuse and neglect doesn't change as a result of that. So you have this intervention that was used and damaged so many families. So there is certainly hope in that we are seeing greater use of our We're now 1 in 4 of our responses to a child protective report are a service assessment rather than an investigation. There's no indication of abuse or neglect. We have begun to inform families at the front door that they do not have to let us in. We are about 2/3 of the way implemented citywide and will be done in the next month or two. And this is something that really raised a lot of anxiety amongst a lot of us at ACS. How do we do this? How do we do it well? How do we make sure? And what would happen? It is a surprise to some of us that really not much has happened. Families have said, I really appreciate you telling me. I knew. Come in and do what you got to do. Now, that's not where we want to be. We want to be in a place where I think because families know that they're still in a system, they're making a choice that's not just based on that moment. It's also about what's going to happen next if I don't. What are the things that I might suffer? Who else might you bring to the door? So there's such an enormous amount of work, and I want to be clear that we're not naive about how much work has to happen there, but we are proud, and so many social workers at ACS, some of whom are here, are driving that change, are pushing me to be more bold in that change. And so I think, one of the major things social workers can be is change agents from within. And that's hard. I mean, people don't want to hear it. And, obviously there's changes in administration and those kinds of things. And so they can also advocate for law changes. We have a lot of work at ACS to treat our providers. I think it's important that they're independent because they bring innovation to the table, but they also need to be treated in parity with the social workers who are doing work at ACS. We've taken a few steps in that direction, but have a long way to go. And we're joined by our fearless deputy mayor who's helping us push in this direction. So I think there is progress and hope, but we are more at the beginning than we are towards the end.
Thank you.
You have to talk.
No, because I don't, this idea of the rhetoric around it, I'm someone of action. I feel a sense of urgency about this. I appreciate Jess, the work that ACS is doing. I just feel more urgency. And so part of what we have done at the Foundling, and I say this because I think people see us as a child welfare agency. We are so much more. Does anyone know that we have 47 Head Start sites on the island of Puerto Rico?
What?
Thank you. But
Get a job at one.
as I go around and talk with people about how we have so many different community-based and education services, and people aren't aware of that. And when I came to the Foundling, the idea that our teams, our staff had of community was not community. It was waiting for people to come. And if I've learned anything about people to come going through COVID, is that people don't come, that they're hesitant, that it's not just about structural racism in the child welfare system, it's structural racism in the system overall. And if we waited for people to come, we wouldn't have vaccinated millions of New Yorkers. We had to go and meet people where they were at. If it was in the public housing community center that we needed to set up a vaccine site, we did that. And it wasn't people who were not from the community. It was hiring people from the community to have those conversations in trusted spaces. And so part of what we've been doing is culture change, and it's not easy. It's hard. I've been at this for 2 years. I'm only on year 3. And sometimes I feel like I want to collapse because you're such a large organization trying to make that change. But it really is forward-facing with our community programs and not waiting for mandated cases to come in. And I've been clear that for me, preventive services should all be voluntary. We shouldn't have mandated families coming in because there is no trust when you're coming in and trying to work with a family that way. And I'm proud that we've done a lot of work and our number of community cases has gone up. But it's taken hard conversations amongst our staff on how to do that. How do you talk in communities? How do you show up? And I think the biggest part that we all don't acknowledge is yes, there's racism, there's bias, and there's bias in each of us, including me. And that shows up in many different ways. And that is something that also now we are starting to have conversations of, and how do we tackle that all the way down to the front line, up to the leadership level. And you catch it in so many different conversations that you have with staff when you go out to your field sites and you're talking with staff, or you're hanging out, doing your business day to day. And it's become clear to me that that is the next piece of work we have to do, which is addressing that bias in all of us. I will say one thing though, I disagree about the money part, about resources to families. Another frustrating thing I find is that we significantly reduced child poverty during COVID because we did two things. We gave people a tax credit and we gave them food, money for food. And then we streamlined the way that we do business, right? You didn't have to go to a cash assistance center, right? You could automatically get your food stamps done. But now we forgot all of it. And we've gone right back to it. Every morning when I'm walking to my office, I see the line starting at 8:30 around the corner, and everybody looks like me. And it is just so like, what are we doing? We know this is not complicated. It's not hard to solve. So why are we backtracking? And I think for me, and having lived through that experience, know what works, and now to be sitting here having the same conversation again, that's the frustration, that's the anger, that's the urgency. And that's the like, I'm not waiting anymore. And I'm not accepting, as I think it is startling how much of us do just accept. And I keep saying to people, like, what is the worst someone's gonna tell you? No? Okay, then we'll figure out another way. And that is hard work, right? It's not in all the things that you're doing on a day-to-day to say, we've got to figure out how to do this differently. We've got to challenge what we're being told is the acceptable way to do work. And it's grueling, right? But that's the part of, I can't wait for systems to change. It's the urgency is here and it's real, and we've got to be able to work within it while we're also advocating for that change.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more, Mel. And then now I'm going to use my clinician hat. And just this one thing that keeps coming up for me is it's my clinician researcher hat, where when I did my research as a doctoral candidate, the moms that I had talked to had a great deal of trauma, and they were hurting. They were all child welfare involved at some point. But there were two things. The removal of their kids was the worst experience of their lives. And the second thing was, of all the experiences they had had, the dismissal of their trauma was sometimes worse than the trauma they'd had. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask that if we're serious about change, if we think about the generations of hurt that you can trace in families back to the 60s. There are families who are 4 generations deep now with child welfare. Think about that. Every generation has been involved in this system. It would be disingenuous of us to now say we're different without acknowledging that harm. If we're going to be taken seriously, if we're going to build trust, we have to acknowledge the harm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I want to say that we had a struggle at JCCA when with a lot of support from our staff and from young people and families, did the best we could to acknowledge that in a statement that's on our website about the fact that we are working in a world, in a country, in a system that, as Mel pointed out, is rife, not just in child welfare, but throughout, rife with challenges related to systemic racism. And systemic racism means that it was part of what our government was a proponent of. And that had a direct impact on families in the 60s, families in the 50s. And that doesn't go away just because we're being reflective. People's pain needs to be acknowledged. I always think of this thing my dad said. So my dad was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he spoke a lot about a letter that he and his family got from the Belgian government with a check for a nominal amount of money, in which the Belgian government sort of apologized and acknowledged how wrong they were for the way that my family was essentially, had to flee their country, which is where they've come from, because of the Belgian government. And it's deep that my dad thought about that so much and loves this letter that exists that acknowledges the pain that was caused by systemic, I don't know what it's called, but anti-Semitism. And Germany did some amazing work in this regard. And it matters. It matters to people. And for us at JCCA, we have to acknowledge that, if you've been around for 202 years in the United States, JCCA had an orphanage in the 1860s. It wasn't big. It was a townhouse group home type setting for young children next door to a home that was for Black kids that was bombed. And there's, recollections in our history about the impact that, that had on kids that were playing with each other in the streets. I mean, that's the history of the United States. And it has, created an enormous amount of pain. So we need to acknowledge that.
And Shirley, if I could, I just want to both Trisha and Ron's point, I think we're clear at ACS that we've caused harm. I think perhaps as importantly, I will say I've caused harm. I was a part of the planning after the death of Nix Mary Brown around the strategies that we were going to use to address those. And one of the strategies that we determined was appropriate was to set a certain number of days of missed attendance that would require a call from the Department of Education. And it was 10 days, and it seemed reasonable. A child's not been there for 10 days. It led to thousands of more investigations than were necessary. There wasn't the infrastructure in place to reach out to the families and actually see how they could help getting their child to school. Instead, it sort of fell on intentionally and sort of by our decision on the child welfare system. The wild thing about that, there's a lot of wild things about that, but that wasn't a lesson learned from that horrible tragedy. The school was calling us saying she's frightened to go home. We didn't need to tell the school to call us more. It was a terrible mistake, and it caused harm for families. And here we are decades later undoing it. But I want to acknowledge having worked in the system for many years, and even with, the intentions there were to try to protect children, but an insufficient knowledge of how deeply an investigation could bring stress into families' lives, even traumatize families' lives. So I want to offer that.
Thank you. I have to say that personally, I'm feeling the pain that's been expressed here, and it's taken us to a different place from where we started. So we started talking about, why can't we keep social workers in child welfare, which seems such a, and now hearing that essentially we've created a system that social workers don't want to be a part of, right? And yet, as Mel, helped us think about, right? We can't be just trying to change the system. We have to be helping people at this moment too. So now I'm going to open this, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions before we, close this evening. But how do we go forward? How do we keep social workers in the system, serving children and families, and work to create a better system that will attract? I mean, in many ways, I feel better that that social justice is coming through and saying, I don't want to be part of this, right? But at the same time, families and children need us. So take out your crystal ball and tell us how to go forward from here.
There's not enough time for that. Also, the mom with 3 kids. I'm like, are we going to get to Q&A? I see there's a lot of questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll offer really quickly. I think we have to invest in the opportunity for, at least from where we sit, continue to invest in the opportunity for our team to become social workers, to develop those skills, and for the provider staff as well. And I don't think we should do it just so they stick around a lot longer. I think it's an investment in more broadly system change. And if they end up in a different place and are changing system, we should trust that is a investment across our community. So I think we need to continue to invest.
I imagine a world with a much smaller, leaner ACS, because it would be less investigative. Because as we know, most investigations are not validated. So we have a lot of energy being spent investigating families who are just like, I'm just tired. Or, some other issue was going on, but not abuse or maltreatment. And a very well-trained staff that can respond to families with very complex needs and who are dedicated just completely to interrupting cycles for families, to having the family they're working with be the last generation involved with ACS, who will do deep dives into returning generations of families to figure out what did we not get right. I'd love an ACS that has a template for what to do really, really well versus built around what went wrong. Can you imagine? Like, how did we do this really, really well? Let's go with that and apply that. I would like to see, and you're going to hear, this is not my voice, this is the parents I talk to, their voices, disinvestment of basic human resources such as childcare from ACS, that there not be the ones who are in charge of vouchers. Like, I think once you have a kid, you should get a voucher. Like, if that kid's going to go to school, you get a voucher. That's it. Or childcare, right? So that's my 2 cents. Like, smaller, leaner, more effective.
I tried that and failed, so. I don't have much to add. I think we've all talked about the systems that need to change. I just keep going back to the urgency. I think the hard part for me for making the transition from where I was to the foundling was, for me, the lack of urgency. Putting aside everything with COVID, it was just so we have a crisis. We have a housing crisis. People are getting evicted from their homes. We need to set up a legal structure and give people access to counsel who can't afford it. And we need to do it now. And we just moved. We moved with such swiftness and urgency and got it done. And so that part for me is the frustrating part. Like, we've been talking about changes for 2 years now and haven't seen much movement. Why do we treat kin placements the same as foster care placements? We treat families that way. It's just all of these things that I feel can be fixable, and we're just not moving with that sense of urgency for me. And that's why I keep going back to, and if I go back to even my first time in government, where I was running the Young Men's Initiative, this whole initiative focused on reducing disparities for Black and brown boys compared to their white counterparts. At the same time that we had a mayor who, and I remember this at a city council meeting where I was presenting on it, and a council member stood up and said, the mayor has an initiative for young men. It's called Stop and Frisk. And I was stunned in that moment, but also realized that, yes, I am part of it. And when I was reflecting back with a colleague who said, you know, it was so frustrating. We were there, we couldn't get things done. And I said, but if not us, then who? And so even within these systems, I tell my staff, like, if not us, then who? We have to figure out a way to, again, I keep saying the same thing, work within, but also push for these changes, but with urgency. I cannot say that enough.
I completely, I don't think I've told myself. I completely agree with the urgency point, and I do think that there are, you know, organizational cultures where there's more urgency or less urgency, and it really takes someone like Mel saying urgency, urgency, urgency. Not everybody feels the same impatience. A lot of people have things going on in their lives that distract them from urgency. I don't like that. I have a very hard time accepting it. But the people who are doing the work are also living complicated lives, also had a pandemic that they had to survive. In terms of the future, I am eternally optimistic. I think that the reason for that is in large part because of like the young people that come into our agencies and have tremendous energy to advance the interests of children and families, and are raising a lot of the concerns that you heard tonight or this evening about the fact that there is a lot of injustice in a system that we think advances social justice. I'm really optimistic that we're having these conversations and that we're taking certain concrete steps, right? You've got a commissioner here who is taking concrete steps. You have leadership that's taking concrete steps. You know, I don't, I want to believe that we will adapt to the reality that was described tonight. It won't happen fast enough, but I think I feel as though every parent really loves their kid and wants their kid to succeed if they only had what they needed to help that happen. That's been my experience after 30 years doing this. I also feel that way about the people who come to do this work, if they are treated respectfully and supported. So I think social workers have a expression for that when it's like, I'm a lawyer, but when it's a parallel process. I taught a course at Fordham, and I learned a lot about parallel process.
Can we give an honorary MSW?
Well, thank you. I want to leave a few minutes now if anyone has any questions. Yeah. That's okay. So everyone can hear you.
Hi, good evening. Hi to Heidi. I received the ACS scholarship for my MSW. I served under the two commissioners. I wish more people were here. It should be standing room only. Oh, I'm Edith Richards. They know who I am. I'm Edith Richards. I'm now at the New York City Public Schools as a health director. I think I need to talk to Ms. Herzog about getting children immunized. I appreciate everything you said, but I just want to say that in 1996, on April Fool's Day, my son's teacher called a report in on me. And as an ACS employee, I was so devastated. And I was embarrassed to say that I worked at the Administration for Children's Services anymore. It was unfounded, but it was the most devastating event in my life. Now looking back, I think maybe it happened so I could know how to better serve my parents. I didn't like it at the time, but I believe everything that we experience, we are able to share that testimony. So I can advocate for my parents. And then I was awarded the scholarship, and I had a bias with substance users. And my professor at Yeshiva asked me, I don't know how you're going to do this, Edith, because you don't have a poker face. And I needed that parent to help me to deal with my bias. And we passed with flying colors. My question, I guess, is how all the changes that we talked about, social work, bias, racism, how do we make the changes? What is the action for me as Edith Richards, a parent, a city employee, a social worker? How do I affect a change? Thank you so much for this forum.
Yeah, well, that's what I was. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, and I want to say, you know, the thing we are most urgent about, amongst many things that we're urgent about, is reducing unnecessary investigations. And I just want to say it again. So there's, 50,000 investigations a year. Now, a quarter of those responses are not investigatory, but they're still coming into someone's home. So we're not saying call us so we can get this other service, but we're trying to reduce harm when we are obligated to respond. But we have to get those unnecessary investigations. We can no longer call in cases to leverage families into services. And there's a lot of that the SCRs used to do something. There's also false and malicious reporting. And so keeping a bright light on that it is 7 times more likely that a Black child's family is going to be called into the SCR than a white child's family. 7 times. And Dr. Stevens talked about the 50%. That is where the greatest disproportionality happens, but it continues to happen right through our system. And we're making some progress in certain areas on that. But I think keep raising your voice within, you're in the system that calls in the most reports. And so and no, we need you there. Yeah. It's some of the reasons I talked about earlier that I'm personally responsible for. We decided we wanted to scare people. We also told people, if there's any problem with the family in the whole world, guess who can fix it? ACS. I can promise you that's not true. So I love, leaner, more effective, and we could talk later about sort of what services should be at ACS and which shouldn't, because I agree, but it's very complicated.
You're the numbers guy.
Thank you. I start by saying I'm not objective because I have the privilege to serve under Judge Richter every day as a lawyer at JCCA that I feel blessed to do. So I start there. But Jennifer Redden-Kassar, thank you. But I sit here as a doctorate candidate pursuing social work. And one of the things I heard is that evidence-based, qualitative research. So I think maybe this question is specifically to Dr. Stevens. How do we get the qualitative data and voices heard in a system that is numbers driven? It is numbers funded. It is numbers based. And how do we get voices to mean the same amount as numbers?
So that's a great question. And so, I mean, my only answer is it's I am simply the vehicle for 1,000 voices that have said enough. And so in the spaces that I bring my research, I never take ownership of that. So in the spaces I'm privileged to be invited into, I'll say things that shift the conversation, surely, because that's what I'm here for, because it's not my voice. I sat and listened for 10 years. And they keep saying the same thing yesterday as they did 10 years ago. So I know the work is not even close to being done. And also, to be very respectful, those voices are demanding and screaming in the streets, on social media. They're showing up when ACS is presenting. This isn't about research voice only. As a qualitative researcher, I'm simply here to be a vessel. But it's respecting that the parents have had enough. They want their children back. And they don't want their kids taken. And they're saying it. So finding a way to be present, to be compassionate, aligned, and also be very respectful about the fact that we're just a part of this story, and they're the ones who've been screaming for decades, and they're the ones who are moving the needle.
So my name is Daryl Armstrong. I'm a pastor from Trenton, New Jersey, former PhD candidate or student here at Fordham under Dr. Shirley and Dr. Larry, when we stepped out. This past Saturday, I went home to Los Angeles, where I was born and raised, and buried my social worker. Roberta Hawkins met me in 1974 when my brother and I were entered into the LA County Department of Child Welfare System. My mother's boyfriend had submerged my 2-year-old brother in a tub of scalding hot water and scalded 2/3 of his body with 2nd and 3rd degree burns, host of other issues. Mom went on to have 2 more boys by the same abuser. Mom's sadly overdosed on crack and heroin in 1998. And one of the hardest things I had to do was go home to LA while in seminary in Princeton and to eulogize my mother. I share that to say, because I think I'm the only Black male in this room at this point, that the disproportionate effect of the child welfare system on Black families, and particularly Black men and Black boys, the research tells us that many men who are incarcerated will trace their abuse back into some experience and exposure to the child welfare system and foster care. So if we're going to prevent men in prison, we got to figure out how to deal with the disproportionate reality of young Black children in foster care at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All that notwithstanding, I share my story of Roberta because when she met my mother and me and my 2-year-old brother, I was 6, my brother was 2. I think she was ahead of her game. She practiced strength-based, trauma-informed social work in 1974 when that wasn't even the norm. And I went on to have a 50-year relationship with this woman. She was at my high school graduation, my Stanford graduation, my Princeton graduation, my marriage, christening of my children. I went home to bury her this past Saturday. She was 90 years of age. She had been at most every milestone of my life, and I tried to say to her, I can't pay you, but what I can do is show you that your investment in the young boy from South Central LA paid off. And so I want to leave not only a positive note to Roberta and social workers, because I hope to create a film and a documentary about Roberta. That's how much I love this woman and thank God for her, and believe our story has something to say to schools of social work around the United States and around the world. But my real question is, how do we create a system in which social workers can create 50-year relationships with boys and girls in foster care and not prevent them from going beyond the professional boundaries and make the effective connection so that there can be some Daryl and Roberta stories because some social worker made a difference, and that social worker was able to keep and nurture a relationship with that kid in care. So that's my question to you all.
Thank you for sharing your story. Beautiful. And I wish you didn't ask a question, because I think ending on it might have been more beautiful. I will say that I think one of the ways in which we are trying to do some of that, and I don't want to answer it in a way that sort of feels complete, because it's not complete, but having young people have coaches until the age of 26 is something we are building universally throughout our work with young people in foster care, and to make sure that they know that we are there for them. And we're seeing those relationships develop into amazing results, but more importantly, to amazing relationships. I don't know there's one that can be as beautiful as the one that you described, but this has to be relationship-based work, and we're seeing people flock to those roles. They don't leave those roles as much, and there's not as much bureaucracy around those roles. And so all the things that we've talked about sort of pulling out tonight from that templated approach that where you can't really see the person in front of you is also a piece of it, right? But I don't have the answer for how exactly to get there, but thank you for giving us a North Star to look towards.
I think that
I just want to say one thing. So I'm so sorry for your loss. I think part of the answer to the question is figuring out how to incentivize what you just described in the social worker that you've known for 50 years. And I do think that without being pithy, I think that lawyers have to understand our work better, because we have so much disincentive for people to be human to each other. And, putting aside caseloads and all of that, we work in a structure where everyone is afraid that they will do something wrong, and it inhibits relationships. It's a very big, big problem. But I think we lose social workers in some ways because it's the legal structure within which we do this work is inconsistent with human relationship.
That's the word.
yeah. Yeah. I think we're going to end now because we're a little past our time, and yeah, I really appreciate you all coming here this evening and having this very important conversation. I appreciate our panelists so much. I think we all learned in the process of talking and sharing part of ourselves and our experiences. I feel like I did, and just, watching reactions around, I just feel that we were all touched in some way this evening. And I think that's a wonderful way to start, or let's say to continue the change that we need to make. And just say thank you again for coming out this evening. And thank you to great panelists.